Yeah, I hardly have to introduce Richard. He's in the community for so long. I checked his blog, and actually that's his second blog. But since he started his blog in 2007, Architectural Musings, he had a stunning 108 million views. So that's quite a lot. Further, he is responsible for writing a handful of books and trainings at Pluralsight. And of course, yeah, he's a public speaker, not just at our event, but yeah, events all over the place. So it's hard to miss him, yeah, when you are into integration as well. And today, Richard is going to explain why organizations are redeveloping and modernizing their software, including their integrations. And yeah, this is indeed, as Steve Jan already mentioned, this is about architecture. So he's certainly going to talk about which kind of patterns you all need to apply, and which technologies you need to use. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you.
Please welcome.
Good. So thanks for having me again this year, wherever Seroter is. It's always an honor that he invites me back for some reason every year. I always know the presentations at this point are decent when you're taking pictures, so just humor me at least and put the camera up of my slides and don't even take a picture. Just put the camera up and I'll feel better. So let's go back 10 years to 2009. I published my first book. Some of you are still buying it for some reason. I keep getting small royalties, which is awesome. Thank you. So this was me kind of trying to codify some of the best practices of integration and things like that for BizTalk people. And that was great. I spoke at the BizTalk user group. I was full of dark hair and hope back then. It was a different time. But as I think back of 2009, like what was I advising some people back then, and they might have ignored me then, and maybe you could ignore me now, but what would the advice be now in 2019? 10 years later, what kind of things are we doing differently in integration so that we're maybe modernizing what we're up to? So of all the things that changed since 2009, I think we've heard a lot about it this week, right? Different patterns, different technologies, completely different expectations. So I'd like to think anything I told you to do 10 years ago, you should probably not do it anymore. So what are those things, right? What are those sort of upgraded ideas or thoughts or patterns that we can talk about today? So we'll do three things. We'll talk about the what and the why of modernization. Why do you even care about this kind of stuff? We'll talk about a handful of considerations you're going to do when you start modernizing software. And then finally, I'll go through a handful of different practices that you would apply and compare my 2009 advice with my 2019 advice. So let's see how that goes. So yeah, last year I swore I would never write a book again, but I wrote one out of peer pressure because other people at my work had written one, and I was said, like, how come Richard hasn't written one? So screw you, I'm writing a book, which is not the best reason to write a book. But it was a good exercise. I got to research a little bit about modernizing .NET apps. It's from O'Reilly. It's also free from the Pivotal site. And so kind of dug into what does it mean to modernize .NET applications. So it kind of put me in a modernization mindset. And so what does Forrester say is modernization? So let's be clear on some definitions. So I like theirs, right? It's transforming application assets, adapt them, optimize them to migrate to or readily integrate with more modern digital software. Right, we're updating things to be able to work with some of the new things. That's what it typically means. But let's talk about the spectrum though, because, and this was touched on a little bit yesterday in the H&M talk. What is this? Because not everything needs to get the full experience. So you are going to retire some things. You're going to replatform some things, which typically means just move it from this kind of host to this kind of host. You'll refactor, which wasn't the one included yesterday, but this is an important one because sometimes you can do a bare minimum of changes to get something somewhere else, and you don't have to overinvest. Sometimes you do rebuild. So for some of us, that's a default mode. We should stop doing that. But sometimes rebuild's a good call. And then sometimes the best thing you can do is replace it with a kind of SaaS version. So if you look at that spectrum of things, on one hand, the impact goes up as you do that direction. And the effort, of course, goes in the other direction. It's really easy to turn stuff off, right? I mean, that's probably the least amount of effort. It's really hard to then, or it's more work to sometimes entirely replace with something in the cloud or rebuild it. But as you're looking at a whole portfolio of things, you're probably going to do a mix of these. It would probably be insane to say we're going to literally replace all of it. It would probably be equally insane to retire all of it unless you're going out of business. So probably somewhere in between is where you're going to spend most of your time. So what do you have in place right now, especially integration-wise? I bet most of this. Who's running Windows Server App Fabric right now? Raise your hand. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. At least a couple of people. Look at you. I wish I had a t-shirt for you. But you're running probably lots of this stuff, right? It's really easy if you were a company formed last week to just be all serverless and cloud native and everything's magical and unicorns, but that's not your life. You're dealing with weird custom functoids and workflows and Windows Server App Fabric and BizTalk 2011 or whatever, and that's fine, that's your life, that's normal. You know, nowadays we're not supposed to say legacy apps, you're supposed to say heritage, which is nicer, because legacy is a bad way to say it, I guess. But I mean, I don't apologize for legacy stuff. That's the reason you're in business today, right? Like your existing software is the reason your company makes money. That is awesome. Let's just make it a little better. Let's try to improve it. So, you know, legacy should not be a derogatory term. So, you know, when Gartner took a look at what are people asking for from integration, and they compared the answers 2016 to 2018. So we're asking for less IoT stuff, which is pretty fascinating, dramatically less for some reason. A lot of application-to-application integration. So people who are stitching together apps are doing the right things. That's what's being asked for right now. So are we building things? Are we set up software-wise to do what people are asking for? Right? I mean, that's kind of as we look at this. Like, what are folks asking for from us? Are we setting up to do that for them? A couple other things as I was going through some great Gartner research on app modernization. So some of their research found that, of course, let's remember that all this new fun digital transformation stuff taps into heritage systems, which means that's where a lot of my business logic is. So we have to remember you're not just modernizing a piece of it. You typically have to touch a lot of things to fix something, right? You just can't put a new UI on something and pretend the mainframe is just still magical. Like, you've got to upgrade a number of things. But what's interesting is how much we are woefully not investing in modernization. So we all love the new hotness, and we're doing really bad about going back and updating some of the things we have. And we'll talk about some of the reasons that's the case. You know, at the same time, instead of treating modernization like a project, you're supposed to treat it like a lifestyle. Like, this is supposed to be something you are always doing, right? You are always modernizing your software because the thing you wrote last year needs modernization. Like, everything kind of has an upgrade cycle. So the problem is that we're doing these big, fat, consultant-led migration projects, and everyone gets frustrated and everyone's disappointed, and then you have to start all over again next year. So that's not great. And then what's interesting is for every dollar invested in digital business, you should expect to spend $3 to modernize. Who is doing that? I would love a show of hands. That would be depressing, because I don't think that's what we're doing, right? Your budget's probably not full of modernization work. So what do we want? I feel like I'm starting a chant. We want integration that's getting things faster, right? We want all those new capabilities, ideally. This stuff should cost less. And it should also be built for maintainability. We always talk about building stuff. We need to talk about maintaining stuff, right? Really easy and fun to build stuff. Not fun to maintain it for a lot of people, but that is where it's going to spend a dramatic portion of its lifespan. So are we building maintainable software? That is probably the number one job of people in this room, or all of us, for building software, is are we building it for the next poor sap, who may be us, who has to run it later? Are we just building tomorrow's technical debt today? Probably. But I would prefer not to be cursing future Richard for the stuff I'm building today. All right, so when we're modernizing integrations and you're starting to think about upgrading these integrations, what are the however many things I listed, things that you should think about? So first off, thinking of system maturity. So you're going to do different things based on, obviously, the maturity of the integration of the software you're dealing with, right? Something that's near the end of its life would be probably insane to completely modernize the whole thing to be flashy, you know, logic apps, event hubs. By the way, we're turning it off next month. That would be nuts. If there's things that are early in its cycle, again, you might use really incubating technology, right? For experiments, you shouldn't even care about lock-in, because I'm experimenting. What if I'm just going to throw this thing away? So I don't over-engineer up front on experiments, right? So for things that are maybe emerging, I'm going to invest differently in technology and modernization than the things that are maybe near end of life or super stable. So even as you're thinking of modernization, you're thinking about how mature is this thing? How much should I invest in it or not? And don't accidentally make the wrong choice here. You're just wasting time and money. The next hard thing is, how do you throw away the book on some of this stuff? How do you unlearn? It's actually a good book I'm reading now by Barry O'Reilly called Unlearn. But this idea of what do you have to unlearn, right? For all of us, we all look like grizzled veterans of integration in this room. So we're all wearing it on our faces. That's fine. We got to forget stuff, right? We have to forget that XML was our entire universe. You know, so we have to unlearn XML as a default format. I've written my XSD schemas. I hope I never do XSLT again, hopefully. So it doesn't mean we're not going to have it. It doesn't mean we're not going to have flat files. But can we default to things like JSON formats? Can we use protocol buffers? Can we use these other formats to make sure that we're dealing with more modern structures than just XML? We might have to unlearn our love for that. I don't know if who loves it, but your like for it. How do we get away from less centralized, or the centralized sort of storage model? Like, hey, everything's got to be in the same place. This is where I'm dropping data to. All the data has to be consolidated. You're not going to have that. Not when every microservice needs a database. If that's the tagline for microservices, your universe is not going to be one data repository. Now you have to think about data integration differently because it's all split all over the place. So we have to unlearn this idea that there's a single source of truth for all data. There might be sources of truth for different domains, and that's it. This changes every 10 years, so I guess in Integrate 2029, I will be here telling you to have really smart pipes and dumb endpoints. But for now, gosh, are we going to be doing this 10 years from now? It'll be really big fonts because I won't be able to see, and it'll all be like prune juice in the back because I'll be an old man. That's an old man joke. So how do we move the business logic into the endpoints, though, now? Because the idea is instead of maybe the ESB model of saying let's have a lot of different intelligence, and we want smarts in our platforms, right? I don't want dumb platforms. They should do instrumentation. Should do some smart stuff. I don't want business logic in there. I want to give data to my downstream systems to do some of the transformation, things like that. How do we unlearn maybe our love of centralizing stuff in the middleware? This has come up a few times, but for teams, how do we get away from being maybe the gatekeeper and you have to ask integration teams permission to do anything to enablers and coaches? It's tough, but that center of excellence model that H&M pointed out about having actually people coaching other groups, that's really important, right? Because you're not going to scale. You're not going to get that rate of what people are asking for from integration if there's a 10-person team that does all the integration for the company. Can't happen. And then finally, gosh, maybe dangerous. You really should not build software that has any dependency on Windows. And not because Windows is bad, but because you're just going to limit your portability. The thing Pivotal does a lot of app modernization, and the hardest, stickiest thing to get rid of is Windows integrated auth, because we put it freaking everywhere, and it's every checkbox in IIS, and so that's really hard to move to .NET Core and Linux and things like that. So you just want to give yourself more options by not relying on the registry or the GAC or MSMQ or Windows integrated auth or things like that. So if you're serious about modernizing software, you have to wean yourself off the machine. Introducing new components. So this is the part, like for me, it's a wasted opportunity if you go to this modernization effort and you keep all the same things that you connect to and the same tools, you just maybe run it in a new place. Like lift and shift to me is the least inspiring thing possible. Sometimes you do it. But for the most part, are you introducing new components? Yes. Public cloud, sure. Right? I mean, we've heard that all week. That's probably a new component you'll introduce into a lot of your integrations. Managed services. So I mean, there was a couple of serverless sessions so far, and we have to be careful to decouple serverless from functions. Those are not the same thing. So serverless, the best definition I use is from the consultancy RedMonk, managed services that scale to zero. Right? I can build a serverless solution with zero functions. It's just a matter of using things that can be completely off and not charged for when they're not running. So when I think of managed services, am I integrating now with things that have that sort of only pay-per-use model, even if there's no functions involved? I might use functions instead of a full-on integration. I might tap into a change feed from Cosmos, send it to another system, have zero running servers, and I have no need for middleware. So functions actually could be one of these stealthy integration tools you're going to start using. Sure, more event brokers, Kafka-esque sort of stuff, event hubs. More API gateways have gotten kind of hot again as a way to do some things at the edge and empower integration that way. Service mesh is the new hotness. So as you think about what's the right way to connect things in a microservices architecture and what kind of things can I offload to these service meshes with dynamic routing, instrumentation, some load balancing, things like that. Then finally, some new protocols. There was, I was reading an article yesterday, I think I tweeted it today, about getting off of WCF because they're not putting it on .NET Core. Suggestion for Microsoft is switching to gRPC, which is kind of weird advice, but you could as a way to communicate. RSocket's also a popular one from Facebook, Netflix, Pivotal, Netify. So making sure that there's other ways to do more reactive streams-friendly protocols. Just something you're going to want to look at, right? As you're modernizing, take it as an opportunity to think of where can I introduce the right new tech, not just resume-driven development, like I want to say I'm using service meshes. Stop that. But use them when they make sense, right? Do things that are going to be sustainable, maintainable. New endpoints and users, right? Another consideration when I'm modernizing integration. So yeah, I have to think about all the SaaS systems. Any sort of commercial API endpoints on the products I'm buying, maybe some custom APIs, right? New things I'm going to be connecting to. What are those things? What do they look like? Who are all those ad hoc subscribers? One of the fun parts of things like Event Hubs and Kafka and whatever is I can have ephemeral resources attached to a data stream, if you will, or a log. So who are these people who might just dip into the stream, do some processing, and get off of there? That might impact what kind of tech choices I make. And then, of course, that term we all know and love, the citizen integrator, right? I've got people who are going to do integration work and not be a hardcore BizTalk certified engineer. I'm going to have someone who's just a good developer who starts to understand stitching together A and B. How do I audit some of the existing skills? So all those things are pretty magical, but if you don't have a team necessarily set up to do all those things, you probably don't stop doing all new work for the next year and a half so everyone can learn Istio. Like that's probably a horrible professional choice. So I'm looking at my team skills and figuring out what do I have that's going to work, and then figure out gaps. Some of the specific areas you're probably going to look at is you need to be good at API design at this point. You need to understand infrastructure automation. If you're missing that skill, that is something you should be hiring for immediately. And then more and more things like event stream processing. Am I hiring people? Do I have the skills? Can I do training to help people actually understand these kind of concepts? If you're missing any of these, they're probably worth backfilling, either training or hiring. And again, figure out the cost, right? What's the cost of getting those sort of skills? Is that going to be prohibitive? Do we have to go contract this out? You should still be trying to be building that native skill, but you might need to temporarily acquire it. What's next? So upgrading your interaction patterns. You're probably going to do more event thinking, whether it's event sourcing and CQRS or these other patterns where you say, look, I'm going to look at my problem area when I'm modernizing my app, and I'm going to figure out, okay, what are the core events we're processing, right? I might be thinking of new interaction patterns, CQRS, where I'm reading from one store, writing to another. These kind of patterns give you a different kind of cloud-native scale. In a lot of cases, just trying to move from pull to push. Not in every case, but again, we're thinking more and more of how do I have systems telling me what's going on. And then from an interaction pattern perspective, ideally no one ever logs into production again. Now that doesn't mean nobody ever looks at production, but it should all be done through automation, right? These great patterns where no one ever SSH or RDPs into a box again should be your goal, because that means you're having to do this one-off sort of management and automation versus systems being able to destroy fleets of servers and replace them or reset known configurations, right? If your goal should be no one ever has to log into a box 12 months from now, that'd be awesome. Right? Because that's going to give you a scale you can't have if you have to do Patch Tuesday where you're going in and nexting installs. So to that point, adding automated delivery, these considerations for this, right? On-demand environment for developers. If right now someone asks for an on-prem integration environment from your team, how soon do they get it? By the end of June? End of 2019? I mean, it just depends, right? Depends on how backed up you are. But can you think of how you can give your teams proper clone environments through automation? Considerations. You shouldn't modernize a single thing that doesn't end up on a pipeline. I don't care what kind of software, right? Custom apps, integrations, everything should end up on some sort of continuous delivery pipeline. Not so you can ship every 5 seconds, but so you can ship whenever you want. I think that's a distinction that matters. And automating the path to production. Right? One of the hardest things to do in almost every enterprise is automating the path to production. And you can get part of the way and you can brag that you've got continuous integration, and now it still sits for a build team for 3 weeks while they prioritize it. You got to automate the whole thing, which is super hard. So it's something you have to aspire to for most companies, especially integration. But as you're modernizing your integrations, this should be on your checklist, that you're not done until you can automate the path to production. Then you got to choose a host, right? Where am I going to stick this stuff? And that's going to, again, factor in. If I'm replatforming, heck, I might just pick up a local environment and run it in a bunch of VMs. I'm switching hosts from my on-prem data center provider to a public cloud one. Or maybe I'm actually refactoring it so it can run in Azure App Service from a custom app or Logic Apps from BizTalk. Make sure we're trying to move things together, right? The hard part with a lot of customers that I've noticed, or a lot of companies, is if you just move one piece, you get penalized with this giant latency of, hey, the app server's over here, database is over here, performance is awful. How did that happen? Stupid physics. So what I need to do is figure out how do I move some of the data systems with the integrations, with the apps, right? How do these things move together? Because if you have migration efforts that just move all your app tier and then your data tier and your integration, that's going to be in a weird state for a long time. Figuring out the usage expectations. Is this thing bursty? Am I going to bump up against resource limits? Right? What do I expect this thing to need? And make sure I'm sizing appropriately. And then really importantly, who's going to own this thing? If you're going to get away from one team owning all infrastructure and move to DevOpsy style, where you're going to have teams that might be owning their version of their platform, that's going to be a different model for you. So is that where you're going to go to, or are you going to continue to have centralized control of this? Do you have to think of tools to help you manage it team by team, or tools to manage it as a whole? Those are going to be tricky things, but based on your choices, you're going to make different decisions. So yeah, you have to decide how you're going to manage it all, right? I might have, instead of monolithic platforms, I might go to micro platforms, which I'm making up a term. Nobody says that, but that's what it feels like, right? I'm going to have a lot of little mini platforms that this team's running their little stack, this team's running their stack and their subscription. And so I'm going to move to this world where I don't have singular view anymore, probably. So what do I do with that? How do I push out updates? What if there's some zero-day exploit in an operating system and we have VMs nested in all kinds of different accounts and different groups? How do I force that to patch? So can you at least pick a few areas you have to be consistent on? Like if it's not identity management, like you have to start there, right? You can't have separate identity management strategies for all your tenants in your account. That's going to be chaos. So how do I at least pick a few things that have to be the same? Even if I give each team a little bit of freedom to choose their programming languages, maybe even their runtime, right? I did a blog post, I think last week, on the 300,000 permutations of platforms you can put on Azure just based on native services. So I mean, there's 10 ways to run a Java app on Azure today. Which one is your team going to choose? Which one's that team going to use? And that team, that team, that team. You just don't want to wake up and realize you have 1,000 permutations that are all running differently. Pick a few things to standardize on. And again, back to figuring out centralized management or not, right? Is it one license of serverless 360 or is it 500 because you have all these different teams? Like those are real considerations for both cost and complexity you have to figure out. All right, so that all sounds great. We're going to go modernize stuff tomorrow. So what's the really hard stuff that, since I don't work at Microsoft, I can say? So you might not have feature parity, right? You might have sat through a lot of talks this week going, that looks really cool. I feel like I'm downgrading to what I have today. That's fair, right? There's going to be certain things that are not yet at parity in a public cloud to what you have in your on-prem system, right? They might be getting there, but you might feel like I have to sacrifice a lot to do flat file mapping, or I've got to do all this different weird stuff. So that might be hard. You might actually have a more complicated solution in the cloud temporarily until feature parity catches up. Performance, are there limits? And I know there are. Things like logic apps executions that you can do in a day or an hour, or things like that. Is that going to throw off your million item per hour processing system you have through BizTalk on premises? If so, you might literally have a problem, right? So do you have the right sort of performance profile mapped to things in the public cloud if that's what you're switching to? If not, you might get a nasty surprise. Again, modernizing integration, I don't know if you can. I mean, maybe that's a bad punchline for this talk. In many cases, I think you have to start over, right? You've got to rethink what this integration is and decompose things, maybe use new systems. You're keeping the same requirements, maybe. But a lot of these things don't lift and shift, right? You are purposely rethinking how does system A talk to system B, and that's going to be a rewrite in many cases. It's hard to prove the value of an upgrade, at least in my experience. How many of you all have had a project to upgrade your software one year that somehow got punted till the next because we can survive another year on this version, right? All the time. So how are you going to go in and say, we're going to need $3 million to upgrade our integrations? You're going to see zero benefit, but it's going to be great. My gosh, who sells that? I'm not that good of a salesperson. So how do you make the business case for this? How do you help someone realize that there is not just back-end value, but either you're getting new throughput, stability, right? Functional value. It goes back to that. If you're doing modernizations to just lift and shift, it is tough to sell that. You've got to sell new value in some way. Even be creative. We can do it together as a team. You might have some critical systems not in the cloud or they don't have APIs that can help you integrate with them. You're still talking to their back-end database, or hey, we're trying to move this to the cloud, but by the way, all our critical data sitting in a Siebel system on premises. Yes, you can use gateways and all these other magical things, but maybe the latency stinks. Maybe there's other requirements that you can't do. So this gets really hard when all of your systems can't move around. And then even when you're done validating measuring the impact of all this, that can be hard, right? I mean, what are your metrics? I hope you're all faking me with the phone stuff. That'd be awesome. What are the value of all these metrics? Right? Are you collecting metrics? Have you started? I mean, I know when Pivotal does modernization stuff, we try to start with value stream mapping and assessments to figure out what's your before state. So at least in the after state, we can say you're shipping faster, you're more reliable, right? You're saving money. So before you start any of these efforts, you better baseline where you're at right now so you can show some value when you're done. It's going to be hard to do that backwards. So these are all the hard things. Now you're terrified of modernization, but that's That shouldn't be the case. It's going to be hard, right? But it should be rewarding when you're done. So what are some practices then? So what would 2019 Richard tell you that 2009 Richard wouldn't even have known about? So let's talk through a few practices I think that matter. So content-based routing. I got to route stuff. What would old Richard have said? I was young Richard, I guess, back then. Young Richard would have said, sure, BizTalk and SendPort subscriptions, right? Kind of elegant, centralized, makes a lot of sense. Promote some properties, everybody's happy. 2019 Richard still likes that solution. Talking in the third person, super strange. I'm going to stop that. But I would use things like Service Bus and Logic Apps now, obviously for cloud. Now, Service Bus can be a little trickier because now I've got to, again, actively promote things from the sender to get them into being routable properties. And then Logic Apps has to do some things. So the benefits of this is you have a very scalable, flexible engine. The downsides of some of this is that, look, I've actually got to peek into the messages for some of this, right? If I'm doing Logic Apps, I've got to actually load the message in and do something with it. And I don't have all centralized rules anymore. That was nice back in the day where I could just pull up and see all the different SendPort subscriptions. When now things are just flying and zipping all over the place in different accounts, how do I have a sense of who actually is listening on this data point? So you have to think about that. You're losing centralization while you're picking up scale and flexibility. What's going to matter more there? Some assets for each one of these. So some good things I've read recently that just talks through examples of this. So I put URLs up there. I'll share my slides as well. But these are things we're solving, all of us here in this room, many of you who are blogging about this stuff, which is great. What about debatching from a database? I went back through some old 2005 blog posts for me for this one. So configuring the BizTalk SQL adapter, right? Debatching the pipeline. Again, kind of elegant. It was nice, figuring out how you actually do, promoting and creating envelopes and debatching. Really elegant stuff to then get maybe all the debatched messages going through the message box. That was nice. 2019 advice would probably be, if it's on-prem, keep debatching in BizTalk. That's great. In the cloud, I'm probably going to debatch in a Logic app. Honestly, the preferable thing would not be debatching at all and literally just be getting live events, right? Batching is sometimes necessary, but in a lot of cases, can I get away from that period and just say, I want to get a live change feed, right? I don't want to batch at all. I just want to literally get them live as they come out. So the benefits of that is, hey, things like change feeds, I'm processing faster. I'm not relying on pipeline magic to magically be decomposing things and figuring out where in the XSD schema it's supposed to tear apart the message and all this kind of fun stuff. How can I get away from the black box potentially and do more? So, all right, risks of that. I have to actually use orchestration to debatch. I can't just rely on a really fast pipeline to zip through my thing and emit everything, which was very convenient and is very convenient today. So I got to actually pay a cost to inflate an orchestration. And this can be a little more manual just to configure all these steps with change feeds and hooking everything up. So I think more powerful to be able to just process data real time. But again, you're going to potentially have a more complex solution than you did before. Again, some good things here from some of you characters. Freaking coded people kept writing blog posts I kept finding, so good job. But it was good stuff. So there's a lot of good advice here. The Cosmos DB change feed's pretty awesome, right? This is a log of the database, which you can subscribe to, and every change to Cosmos emits something, and the functions can subscribe right to that. So literally every record that hits the database can immediately trigger a function. Why do I need batching? That's a really nice solution. If I can do that on the relational database too, that's magic. What about high volume data processing? How did we do this back in the day? Well, we deploy separate servers and put our processing hosts here and receive hosts here and send hosts there and all kinds of wild topologies to split out processing. And that worked really well, right? Some crazy high volume. And so the advice now is, of course, again, in some cases that's still going to work for you. But how do I use some of these cloud services for some of the real-time event intake and processing? Even Data Factory for bulk processing, right? There's going to be reasons for this high volume data processing where the cloud's giving me a lot of value because I can just throw virtually infinite amounts at it and even process that data on the fly in some cases. So again, benefits of this: scale, low maintenance, right? Some really cool functionality that comes in these services that I have easy access to. There's some risk there though. Also, those quotas can catch me, or all of a sudden I'm paying some super high bandwidth charges, which I maybe wasn't expecting before, and even storage costs. Again, it's really hard to calculate cloud costs, I think, for normal humans, because it's not like, oh, well, 3 cents an hour for this thing, minus these 14 other charges that come in based on regional replication and things like that. So You just have to really model this out to make sure it won't bite you. And then, again, troubleshooting, recoverability, right? Depending on how I build this, this could be a tricky solution if parts of it crash or parts of it fail. So powerful, right? But there's still, again, caveats. And again, some good things here, using things like Azure Databricks for real-time processing, Spark processing, things like that. Using Data Factory looks like a pretty nice tool for large volumes in a lot of cases. Okay, what do you do with replaying data streams? So what was my advice in 2019? I built this, I think, a few times, is that you could actually have a pipeline, you'd have an orchestration or a send port that would take every inbound message and write it out to some sort of log database, right? Some historian, some database, whatever. And then if for some reason some send receiver downstream collapsed and said, oh, shoot, you sent me all this stuff, but I need it again. How am I going to get it to you again? Is we'd actually be able to route it back through BizTalk from the database back to the endpoint. So that was kind of a decent little replay, a little complicated, but it worked, right? So that was not bad. So my advice now would be this is the use case for a distributed log, right? Where I'm turning the database inside out, I'm listening in on the log, I'm getting the event stream, and at this point, it's not a message broker, right? It's an event bus or a distributed log like Kafka, like Event Hubs, where I'm just going in and reading what I want to read, right? It's more like a database than a message queue. So in that case, it plays really nice to that. So what's fun here is there's no extra things I have to set up, no new database I have to set up and then write everything to, and hopefully that gets written successfully and all that. And then consumers can just naturally attach to this after the fact, right? It doesn't even matter if they were online when that data came in. I can come in at any time, listen to the log, or read from the log, drain a bunch of information, and even disconnect. It doesn't matter. So it's kind of a neat way to replay and see what happened before. But what are some risks? We heard this from Dan yesterday. If you're dropping in Kafka as a replacement for your message queue without understanding what Kafka is fully, you're probably making your life more difficult. Kafka is awesome. I love it. It's great. It's a distributed log. It's not queuing, right? You don't have those competing consumer semantics. You don't have some of that store and forward kind of directed routing. You're putting more responsibility on the client. All fine trade-offs, but it's not a drop-in replacement for a message queue. So it's a different kind of use case. Also, long-term storage. Like, these things are not databases, right? They're caches because they will eventually purge that data. That's how they're set up to be. Now, can I treat these things like a database and just keep throwing storage at it? Technically. They're not databases, though. So you still have potentially a long-term storage issue because that data will not be there for very long. I think the default on Event Hubs is 7 days, whatever it is, right? So it's more like a cache, which is fine. But if you need something that has actually long-term retention, that is not the answer. And some good things here. There's a great doc on the Microsoft site actually comparing all of these messaging solutions because you can't tell a service without a program. There's a lot of stuff going on. And then I wrote up something a couple months back on actually reading from Event Hubs using a Java app. And part of the thing I was demoing was actually doing that replay. I would just have another consumer add a connector later after I'd already sent a bunch of stuff in. And sure enough, it just drains everything out. So kind of some neat ways to think about how do I access high volume data and then watch it anytime I want, right? Just very different from a queue, though. It's a different semantic. Business rules. Oh, I was such a BRE fan. That was that business rule. I built some tools that, again, some of you people still weirdly use, which is really cool. But I like the business rules engine. And you might throw some functoids in there, do some cool business logic and all this stuff, have some of these disastrous maps, which we'll talk about in a second. But still, I think even the advice then, I believe, was, hey, don't be throwing a ton of logic in things like orchestration, functoids, things like that, right? Be very careful with that. Business rules engine was a good choice. So I think now my advice would be, look, all that business logic should be in things like APIs, should be in functions, should be in separate version-controlled, continuously delivered sort of components. And I shouldn't be doing a ton of logic when it comes to maps. Maps should be for transformation, not making complex decisions, if you will. So the benefit here is the flexibility and the fact that any developer can do this, right? I don't need to have some sort of expert who has everything on their desktop to load the business rules engine, which was somehow promised to be like a business analyst tool. I don't think any business analyst ever used it. But that's fine. Like, any developer can build a function, right? Any developer can build an API. And so you start to, again, stitch these things together with more people versus having a concentrated set of folks. Now, there's a risk, right? Part of the risk here is more moving parts. All of a sudden I have this logic app call out the 6 functions and do this sort of stuff. Like, I just want to transform the freaking flat file. Like, this is really complicated. So that's legit, right? That's something to worry about, that you might do too many callouts, and you're jumping out of process, right? I'm not just in this process doing all this stuff. I'm incurring latency. I have more places things can fail. So again, I got to make those trade-offs on how overcomplicated do I do this. Don't over microservice yourself. Now, of course, I include, what do I include? I include a link to someone using Liquid templates, but this was a good blog post on how do I do some of these more complex business rule things in a map. So you can do that, just be careful, behave yourself. Stateful workflows with correlation, right? How do I do these long-running sort of processes? 2019, I mean, gosh, orchestration's really good at this with dehydration, right? Thing could just dehydrate forever. And I could easily do correlations and convoys and all kinds of fun stuff. Transactions, compensation, pretty sweet. Still good. In 2019, you're looking at things like durable functions, logic apps, service bus, and ideally you're breaking apart some of these monster orchestrations that had all these sort of crazy decisions and it would sleep at different points and 9 parallel branches, and saying maybe that should be like a choreographed set of activities that all have a shorter lifespan, right? Where I can make changes in flight, right? I don't have this just monolithic beast that nobody can maintain. So again, the benefit, anybody can do this. Anybody. Most people can do this in the development team. Versus somebody trying to build a really complex orchestration, which we would all just snapshot into our design docs and impress our bosses. I've been there. But for the normal humans who have to maintain it, like we should build stuff that's more maintainable there. So what are some risks? You're going to hit some limits. How long can that thing live? Right? And then you're going to lose some of that centralized coordination. Because as I start decomposing these things, as I start trying to get a viewpoint of what's going on, again, I've lost that. I've lost that sense of what's running, how long, where, all that sort of thing. A number of good things. Tone and others have done some good things on durable functions, correlation with logic apps. I think this is an interesting space we probably have to play around with more to see how all this stuff behaves. But if you're coming from a BizTalk background, some of this will feel somewhat familiar. Complex data transformations. I almost tried to include one of those just gnarly map pictures that either I've created or some of you characters have. But my advice before was sure, use the mapper to transform data structures, use functoids, hey, inline code. I found a lot of my old blog posts about all the C# I could embed in a map. What was I doing back then? It was fun and it worked. But now I would probably say, map it on the way out, not the way in, and maybe not at all. Like maybe we should stop having the middleware do all the mapping and instead rely on the clients to take the data in its raw format, right? Not mapping it on the way in because now you've immediately lost whatever that initial message was. You've transformed it, maybe with good intention, but maybe I want the raw data and the subscribers decide if they want to transform it or not. Subscriber takes the raw data in. The middleware gets out of having to maintain that whole life cycle for all kinds of different subscribers, right? The event hubs and the Kafka model is, here's the raw event coming in. There is no option for transforming it. You pull it from the log and you do whatever you want with it. You party on it however you want. BizTalk world, we could get away with, well, let's help you out. Let's transform it. Let's manipulate it. We should be less kind. We should be giving you raw data and you figure it out, client. And that's probably more scalable. Be nice about it, but yeah, make them do the work. So the benefits of this, right? Get rid of any of that brittle logic in some of the maps. They're super complicated as you have all kinds of loops and fun things like that. And just create the expectation. Receivers take the data and figure out what they want to do with it. Now the risks there is, look, some of this is not going to work for certain formats. Some of this is not going to work with really difficult EDI, crazy transformations that have maps that call maps that all loop and do things that create weird inception problems. That's fine, and it puts new responsibilities on clients. They might not be ready for that. They like the fact that you gave them a nice transformed, cleaned up, deduped, whatever thing. Now you're just turning on the fire hose and saying, like, have fun with this. That might be tough organizationally. So you might have to ease people into that. And again, number of good blog posts here, inbound, outbound maps and logic apps, complex transformations in logic apps, doing XSL mapping with Azure functions, which again, you may decide to call XSL from functions to just have your worlds collide. Guess that's cool. Integrating with cloud endpoints. What would I have recommended in 2009? Back when I spoke at that user group, I was actually demoed 10 years ago, Google App Engine, calling a Salesforce thing, going through the Azure Service Bus, which was called something else back then, and returning results. So I think it was still, BizTalk can do crazy stuff. Like, isn't this wild? I had pipelines that would do credentials. It was a fresh time for me. Now the advice would be different, right? If you're connecting to any cloud systems, Logic Apps should be the answer. Is there a great reason to do anything else? Now with a Logic Apps adapter, even if all you do is use it as a dumb cloud connector tool, use it as a dumb cloud connector tool. Like, it's gonna make your life easier. It's meant to do that sort of stuff. So if you're connecting to any sort of SaaS system, any online storage, SharePoint Online, any of that stuff, just have the Logic app do the work. Let BizTalk do on-prem stuff. So 2019 benefits for that advice is, again, more developers can do this, right? I can have even more maintainable integrations because things are doing best of breed connectivity versus trying to make things do things they shouldn't do in unnatural ways. Once again, more components though. There's risk. There's risk that you're building a more complex integration because now you just don't have one set of orchestration. Now it calls out to a Logic Apps adapter, which now calls Salesforce and munges data together and returns it all. There's more going on there. So you'll all be employed for a long time. So some things to point you to here, right? These were mentioned yesterday a couple of times, but things like Salesforce and Twilio are really easy to connect to with Logic Apps. You know, just let's make our life easy. Let's not reinvent the wheel where we don't have to. They've already solved this problem. So let's not purposely create our own clients to these sort of things. Throttling and load leveling, right? This is, again, great feature of what you do in 2009 is, look, I could do throttling settings in BizTalk. I might even inject MSMQ or some sort of staging database in front of BizTalk or even at the end of it if I wanted to purposely throttle it. I used to have systems that would collapse if I sent too many messages to it because it wasn't ready for it. So you'd have to do this kind of single send port thread out. Like, yeah, it's some really cool features to purposely slow things down. That's neat if you want to go slow. My 2019 advice is keep separating the intake from the processing. That's where some of these cloud systems are amazing because I can beat the daylights out of it more than anything I could probably do on premises, especially with things like Service Bus and Event Hubs, is I can flood those things and then still choose to consume it at my rate, right? I can purposely do that sort of consumption model that works for my system. Even Azure API management lets me do web request throttling and purposely send rejections back to the caller if they've exceeded a certain throughput limit, right? I can prevent stuff getting into my on-prem systems until I'm ready to consume it. That's neat. That's powerful stuff. Benefits? Yeah, almost infinite scale with zero pre-provisioning. I mean, that's great. Now, Event Hubs, you have to pick partitions and things like that. Service Bus, I don't believe there's anything you have to do ahead of time. Just beat it up. And so that's much better than on-prem where all of us have just sized all the hardware for the peak that happens once a year and it sits at 1% utilization the rest of the year. Maybe we can stop doing that. And instead for the really heavy intake stuff, I can use the sort of cloud to buffer it all. And then I can just keep on-prem doing what it's supposed to do. So some risks, latency could be a risk here, right? I've got things popping through here and jumping down here. Depending on how far away some of these data centers are, I could actually feel that. That might be too slow for me. I got to think about security maybe a little bit more. Is just making sure like this isn't now all in my network. I can't just rely on certain things. I've got to make sure the payload and the transports are all protected. Again, some things here. It was a somewhat finished blog post on scaling, controlling scale of Logic Apps. There's a queue-based load leveling using functions blog post there. So some good stuff there on how do you use this tech to control flow. Strangling your legacy ESB. Sounds like a violent claim, but strangling the monolith is a pretty popular pattern for how do you take a big system and start to carve it up. This is all very violent. And turn it into smaller bits. And I can slowly get rid of that monolith by replacing it with new stuff. So in 2019, I was hired specifically by a company to replace their old TIBCO stuff with BizTalk stuff, is you would just initially, obviously, put new integrations in the new stuff and incrementally move the old stuff. Like that's not rocket science. 2019, pretty similar. I would just say you're not going to modernize to a single environment anymore. Like there is no go from A to B. Now it's go from A to B to C to D. I'm fanning out my things because some things are going to go to different types of solutions. So don't assume I'm going to go from one thing to another. Don't even just go from BizTalk to Logic Apps. That'd be a waste. There's a lot of other things you should use. Sometimes Logic Apps is unnecessary, right? Pick the right thing for the environment there. So the benefits, right? I get into some more of these managed systems, hopefully, as I'm using more cloudy stuff where I don't have to do operations and backups and things like that. But the hard part with this, especially when people start strangling monoliths, is that you end up kind of half and half, right? I'm in both camps. And all of a sudden now I've got all this kind of cloud cost and skill. Clearly I've got all this other stuff and skill. And it doesn't matter even if it's cloud or not, right? If you were switching from TIBCO to BizTalk and you're going to run both systems for the next 5 years, like that's a high cost. So what is your strategy to get moving, right? You don't want to be in this sort of half-pregnant mode for 5 years. That's not good. So that's one of the challenges here is that these things need to have momentum because otherwise you really are going to be not only frustrating people who can't see value, you're actually increasing the cost of IT in this sort of phase. So getting integrations into production, what was the pattern there? This was living with MSIs and packaging up all the scripts and assemblies and all that kind of stuff. That was kind of cool. Then you double-click those bad boys over to production and cross your fingers on a Friday night, and it all just worked, mostly. Now the goal would be all of this is on pipelines. Right? Again, I don't care if you only deploy once a year, it should be on the pipeline. Because somebody's going to want to come in and make a change, and it should not require 6 tickets and 9 teams all swarming. Everything should have a path to production. It doesn't matter how often it's used. The hard part with this stuff is the zero downtime deploy stuff. We're all used to weekend maintenance from our, somewhere in our career. I would argue that's unacceptable at this point. Any downtime for any system should be unacceptable. Now, you have to get there. But how are you deploying integrations and apps in a way that do not require downtime? Because most of our systems are no longer 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. I'm accessing things all the time. I need real-time insight and data sync. So how are you architecting in a way that lets you hot swap components without taking downtime? So benefits of all this, if you put everything on pipelines, sure, going to probably reduce downtime, get delivery velocity a little better, get rid of humans where we can. Let's welcome our robot overlords into the deployment space because we're not great at it. So let's have robots do it for us. There's risks with this stuff, though. I'm not delusional. So this is complicated. If I have an integration that involves this, calling this, and these all have to move together, not to mention, do I lose stuff in flight? So that all of a sudden I have some data loss, I have some weird ordering that happens because things fall out of sync. That's a real thing, right? Google was offline for how many hours over the weekend just with a configuration change? Freaking Google, they should be awesome at this. And yet they're off for 5 hours because they configured something wrong in an infrastructure pool. So updating things all the time is hard. Anybody who says the opposite is selling you something. So this takes work, right? But the value, the payoff is super high. And there's some good stuff. Stevian did a great blog post last week or 2 weeks ago that kind of looked at the life cycle of a logic app and walked through the deployment, the development, the upgrade, right? That's a real thing. I would argue that being able to deliver software reliably, repeatably to production is the secret, most important thing you need to do in IT. Almost more than anything else is you have to get software to production in a reliable way because you're going to have to do updates and fixes and patches and whatever. If you're not good at that, the rest of it might not matter. It's a hot take, but it feels right. Building integration teams. I think it's the last one. My advice in 2019, I quoted myself, which is maybe a very arrogant thing to do. Invest in training and build a center of excellence. All right, that's not super wrong, but I would say now, more again like the model we heard yesterday, is instead these centers of excellence are not doing all the work. That would be a mistake now. The center of excellence should be also coaching others, building more skills into the team, and maybe running the platform as a product. Right? Platform as a product is arguably how DevOps happens at enterprise scale, meaning instead of an operator on every team trying to help everyone just do infrastructure as code, instead, I'm actually having shared platform teams run the core platforms and you just DevOps yourself down to the platform, right? The application platform, the integration platform. So maybe the team that runs BizTalk, runs cloud stuff, runs Azure, Logic Apps, maybe they offer that as a service and then teams are just running and maintaining their own integrations. Whatever it is, this is the evolution some ops teams have taken where they start running platforms as products and that's their new task. So what's the benefits of this, right? Fewer bottlenecks. I was part of an integration center of excellence I think I helped create, and it was fine, but you were a bottleneck, right? You had to wait in the queue for the next integration expert to be available. It doesn't scale when I'm trying to do more and more integration. This is the most important work happening in most places is connecting their systems. It can't rely on a small set of experts. It simply won't be successful. So there's risks, right? I've got more distributed ownership. Who in the world's doing what? They're not following the best practices. They're not using our naming standards, all the things that make us bristle. We got to accept it. Right? The only way this stuff scales is to maybe lower the bar just a little bit and just say, look, everyone won't be a certified integration engineer, but they're going to connect stuff faster and mostly reliably. But again, you lose some of the visibility as well, the centralization if each team is kind of connecting their own stuff. So you have to pay attention to tenancy again, who can run what. So I'll close with this. I just think you need to stop and have a very thoughtful approach to modernizing integration. Like, this is a real strategic imperative, I would think, for almost everybody, especially in this room at this conference. And how are you then specifically not thinking of the tech? Your modernization, like if anybody says our digital transformation is powered by Kubernetes, they should be fired. Because it doesn't matter. Like, yes, it's cool tech. Your digital transformation is more than a tech, right? Your integration is more than logic apps. So if you have someone that's myopic, then it's going to be a problem, right? This stuff has to matter. People, process technology, the whole shebang. So if you do that stuff, you're going to be in awesome shape. But integration people should have a seat at the table when it comes to modernization. This is not just about custom apps or your infrastructure. This might be the most important one. So that's why I'm glad I get to talk to you about it. Thank you.
Covey.co